Thanks for the welcome. It's actually nice to be in Hawke's Bay again. I've had quite a lot of contact with Hawke's Bay in the past, but the weather's been lovely, and it just reminds me of what a nice place Napier, Hastings, Havelock North, the Herretonga Plains are. You can hear me? That's good. Yes, my links with Hawke's Bay in the past were that I actually served as a church minister, mostly in Napier, but I also had up to 14 months in 2 years serving as a student pastor in the Reformed Church of Hastings, which I believe still exists. And in Napier, I worked in what was St. Peter's Presbyterian Church, then became Napier West Presbyterian Church, and then I moved out for 4 years to Tamatea, and I worked as a minister in a combined Anglican Methodist Presbyterian congregation there. Left Hawke's Bay in 1979. So you may ask, with that sort of background, how have I got to being here and speaking at this meeting now? Well, from childhood I was groomed by my parents, but also by myself, to study theology and to become a minister. So that's where I headed. I did early on ask questions like, how did we get here? Where did it all come from? What's it all about? What's the meaning? What's the purpose of it all? But being naturally inquisitive, I thought I would get answers to questions like that in theology. So the obvious way was to go to theology. I could have gone to philosophy. I did study some philosophy, which didn't seem to give many answers. I could have gone to science, but I was not that way inclined. But even while I was working in ministry, other questions bothered me. For example, I remember when I was working for the Reformed Church, driving out into the country from Havelock North somewhere to track somebody down. I didn't track them down in the end, but I stopped somewhere and thought to myself, this original sin business, that our children, that we are all born and conceived in sin and are inevitably doomed to be sinners. And if you believed in predestination, which is what I as an Orthodox Calvinist was supposed to believe in, what's that all about, Why have any children? If they're inevitably going to be sinners, and if the large number of them, including possibly some of my own, are going to end up in hell forever and ever. Why? Doesn't make sense. But then I swallowed that again. And then what about the doctrine of the Trinity, One God, 3 persons, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. The mathematics doesn't make sense. And where did God come from? Well, the answer I got about that was, it's not really an answer. It's a mystery. It's beyond human understanding. Such questions can drive you mad. You get an infinite regression, Here's this world, where did it come from? It came from God. Where did God come from? Where did whatever lay before God come from? It just goes on and on. You have to stop somewhere. Well, actually, you could just stop with this world or with this universe and say that's it. It's really no more difficult to take that position than to have to go to God and with all the problems that leads to that. Luther is reputed to have said, God created hell precisely for people who ask those sorts of questions. There you go. Anyway, I went to university to prepare for theological study. I studied Greek and Hebrew, philosophy, biblical history, literature, ancient history. It's a good background for studying theology. And then I went to Australia to do my basic theological training. It was a fairly conservative training, but 2 of the professors at least taught us to ask questions. And when they presented the views of people that they disagreed with, they didn't tell us that to begin with. They gave us such an outline of the views of the person they disagreed with that you almost believed it by the time they'd finished. Then they started to demolish that position, but they were actually quite open. And then I went to the United States, to Philadelphia, to a very conservative seminary, and I wrote a thesis there. The title was Evolution and Sin in Catholic Theology. Evolution and Sin in Catholic Theology. I don't know if you understand the problem, but I'll try to explain it to you a bit. Traditional Christianity has a chronological scheme. Creation, which is perfect, because God created it, couldn't be anything other than perfect. Further on, the fall, human sin, and so all the rubbish that we live in now, and that bothers us, came around. And then, of course, redemption. Jesus was sent down to save us from the mess that we made when we wrecked the perfect creation. But it was dawning on me at that time that evolution could not be simply dismissed, because that creation, fall, redemption order rules out evolution, it seems to me. But it was dawning on me that evolution could not be simply dismissed. And there had to be an accommodation. And there had been an accommodation with those two positions within the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And so I studied Catholic theology for a year. And I thought that perhaps we Orthodox Reformed people could learn from the Catholics. And my conclusion was that we could. And that got me into trouble back home when I got back here. The rumour was around that Rinny is soft on evolution. And after a year or so as a student pastor here in Hastings, this is Havelock North, Hastings, and several grueling oral exams, I was finally cornered. And the question that was asked me when I was cornered was, do you believe that God used an animal in the creation of man? And I thought a bit, and then I replied, I don't know, I wasn't there. And that was curtains for me as far as working in that church was concerned. So after working some time in Oratory Freezing Works, the Hyde House in Hamilton, I eventually went to the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand. In those days, it was a much more middle of the road and even predominantly liberal church. It's the church from which, which had Professor, now Sir Professor Lloyd Geer as one of its key people. He's still a member, he's still a minister of that church, but he could equally be a member of the Rationalist and Humanist Society while being a theologian. I think he could. But that liberal atmosphere of that church at that time began to influence me more and more. And as I described theological liberalism, I begin with an 18th century German theologian by the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Anyone heard of him? Yeah, a few people have. Schleiermacher didn't really accept revelation, the revealing of God in the traditional sense through the Bible and also, through prophets and so on. He said religion and religious commitment was based on what he thought was a universal feeling of absolute dependence on God, on the universe. Call it what you will. That it's on that feeling of absolute dependence and how that is worked out that religion comes into being in all its different forms. Religion is an expression of awe and wonder in response to that feeling. And I know about that feeling, when I walk along the beach and hear the surf, or had I been in Christchurch a month or two ago and the whole place was going like this, I would have felt that absolute dependence. I'd be pretty fearful too about it. I think Schleiermacher was influenced by the Dutch philosopher Spinoza, who sometimes you read him and you think he's an atheist, and then he talks about God again. And by God he means the laws of nature, the rules of nature, or the creative aspect of nature. And in fact, Spinoza said